Hello and welcome. Having a tulpa is sometimes perceived by those naive to the phenomenon as a manifestation of mental illness. In this video, I'll be arguing not only that this perception is false, but also that it stems from an antiquated and stigmatizing conception of mental health. But before I dive into this topic, there's a lot of context that I feel obligated to discuss. I want to make it clear right from the start that I have absolutely no formal training or expertise in psychology, psychiatry, cognitive science, sociology, neuroscience, philosophy, cultural anthropology, or any of the other innumerable academic disciplines which offer valuable, well-supported perspectives on mental health issues. Given that I am just some person on the internet, you ought to treat anything I say about a complicated and controversial topic like the categorization of mental disorders with skepticism. By extension, you should be even more skeptical of anyone making objective claims about the topic without either including this kind of disclaimer or at the very least providing citations to reputable sources. As a counter-disclaimer to this disclaimer, I also think it's important to recognize that the very concept of mental health is, to a significant extent, culturally relative. It is true that we can make objective claims about the complex relationships between genetics, environmental effects, brain activity, and patterns of thought and behavior. However, when we attempt to label psychological phenomena as either healthy or unhealthy, we're necessarily making value judgments, which are generally understood to be outside the purview of science. What counts as a mental disorder in one society might be considered normative in another. And this isn't just some minor technical point. Overconfidence in the authority of experts and dominant cultural norms could lead us to ignore or dismiss the experiences of people who are actually impacted by our conception of mental illness. For instance, we don't have to go back very far in the history of the United States to find women being diagnosed with hysteria and involuntarily subjected to cruel and dehumanizing treatment. The systematic and pseudoscientific pathologization of gender and sexual minorities persisted well into the late 20th century and is still having discernible effects on society today, for example in the discourses surrounding rights and protections for transgender and non-binary people. The discipline of psychiatry is without a doubt much more humane than it used to be, thanks in large part to the persistent efforts of activists and patient advocacy groups. Cultural attitudes towards people experiencing mental illness have also generally improved, although research suggests that there's still a long ways to go, which leads us back to the topic at hand. There's a tendency for people to use the label of mental illness in order to dismiss or invalidate the experiences of others. Using psychiatric terms in the pejorative contributes to the stigma surrounding mental illness by implying that those affected by them are dangerous, inferior, or not worth taking seriously. When people claim that having a tulpa is a mental disorder, this harmful style of thinking is almost always operative to some extent, consciously or otherwise. As I mentioned in my previous video, the experiences reported by tulpa creators are often unsettling to the uninitiated because they subvert deep social norms and seem to contradict popular understandings of identity and selfhood. It's far easier to dismiss tulpa creators by calling them mentally ill than it is to reevaluate core beliefs. If you accept as an axiom that every human body can and ought to support only a single persistent self-construct, then you will inevitably conclude that any other arrangements of self-identity are pathological. This perspective relies upon a rigid, incorrect, but familiar model of selfhood which, in my opinion, is best challenged by introspection and personal experience rather than logical arguments. The difficulty is that those who are most likely to react negatively to tulpa creators are also probably the least open to alterations of their own conceptions of identity. Perhaps in the future, as we learn more about the neurological underpinnings of the sense of self, cultural attitudes towards those with different arrangements of self-identity will become more accepting. As things stand, it's unavoidable that some segment of the population will respond to the experiences of tulpa creators with antagonism and ridicule. While such reactions can be hurtful, especially when they come from a trusted friend or family member, it's important to keep in mind that they generally stem from ignorance rather than malice. Further, these defensive responses often coexist with genuine concerns for a tulpa creator's well-being. Such concerns aren't entirely unwarranted. The few surveys that have been conducted on the relationship between tulpa creation and mental health suggest that a number of conditions, including depression and generalized anxiety, are significantly more prevalent among tulpa creators than in society at large. However, there's plenty of reason to be skeptical about the direction of causality here. Perhaps people with strong social anxiety or feelings of isolation, for instance, are more likely to create a tulpa for companionship. Indeed, a significant percentage of tulpa creators with diagnosed mental disorders reported that having a tulpa helped improve their conditions. More research would be necessary in order to make strong conclusions, but for this video it suffices to say that there isn't currently any scientific evidence to suggest that creating a tulpa makes a person more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, or any other mental illness. Still, there are some people who argue that merely having a tulpa should count as a mental disorder, even if it doesn't perfectly match any existing diagnostic construct. As I mentioned earlier, these types of classifications are culturally relative, and thus intrinsically subjective. In light of this, the best that I can do as a non-professional is to identify the criteria by which a psychological phenomenon is labeled as a mental disorder within our current socio-cultural context, and then do my best to apply those criteria to tulpa creation. A good place to start is with the following definition provided by the latest version of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which mercifully is usually just called the DSM-V. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior, for example, political, religious, or sexual, in conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society, are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual, as described above. We'll go through these criteria point by point. Tulpa creation can fundamentally alter the way a person relates to their thoughts and actions. So if we ignore the negative connotation, having a tulpa could certainly be considered a disturbance in an individual's cognition and behavior. However, that disturbance typically does not reflect any dysfunction in processes underlying mental functioning. In some cases, having a tulpa can even improve a person's ability to socialize and process difficult emotions. Now, there are some reports of serious deleterious effects resulting from tulpa creation, but the same can be said of nearly any intensive introspective practice. There's some evidence to suggest silent meditation retreats may induce psychosis in a very small minority of participants, but it would be absurd to use these rare adverse events to argue that everyone who goes on a retreat is mentally ill. Similarly, we ought to base our judgment of tulpa creation on the average experience, not the worst-case scenario. In this vein, having a tulpa does not generally cause significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. Lastly, having a tulpa could easily fall under the category of socially deviant behavior. As I emphasized in my previous video, tulpa-like phenomena have been embraced by a significant number of societies and cultures throughout human history. Just because this modern incarnation of the practice currently lacks broad social support doesn't imply that it's a mental disorder. The relative acceptability of certain religious practices really hammers this point home. If I claim to have a deep personal relationship with a partially autonomous being co-inhabiting my brain, then some significant proportion of the population would label me as mentally ill. But if I also believe that the being is omniscient, omnipotent, and potentially willing to perform miracles on my behalf, then I could just be a Pentecostal Christian. My point here is not to mock people with religious beliefs. In fact, I'm aware that there are a number of tulpa creators who are also deeply religious. Rather, I think that this observation reveals a double standard in the way people tend to think about mental health. Objectively similar phenomena can be perceived as either healthy or dysfunctional on the basis of arbitrary socio-cultural context. The intention behind the last sentence of the DSM-V criteria is pretty clear. We shouldn't call something a mental illness just because it violates our social or cultural sensibilities. In conclusion, having a tulpa fails to meet the inclusion criteria for classification as a mental disorder, and might even meet the exclusion criteria concerning social deviance. When I started researching the theory underlying the DSM-V criteria, I was unsurprised to find that the definition of mental illness is subject to a tremendous amount of scholarly debate. I'm sure that I could spend years immersed in the topic and still only scratch its surface. If anyone is interested in some academic analysis of the proposed DSM-V criteria prior to its publication, I've linked an interesting paper on the topic in the video description, which also serves as an excellent starting point for further reading. I mention the paper because it discusses criteria for the creation of a new diagnosis. When considering whether to add a psychiatric condition to the nomenclature or delete a psychiatric condition from the nomenclature, potential benefits, for example, provide better patient care, stimulate new research, should outweigh potential harms, for example, hurt particular individuals, be subject to misuse. It's clear that the primary motivation for creating and using a diagnostic construct is to improve the quality of care for individuals who need it, and to facilitate a clearer understanding of the mechanisms underlying distress or dysfunction. Psychiatric diagnoses are not insults, nor are they catch-all terms for people who exhibit psychological differences which violate social norms. Their use as such can be reflective only of ignorance. As we arrive at the end of my analysis, I'd like to reiterate once more that this topic is far from my area of expertise. While I've done my best to develop and present a well-researched perspective, I'm open to the possibility that I've made serious errors, either of fact or omission. On the off chance anyone with clinical or academic experience related to this topic is watching, I'd be eager to hear your take on my views. In closing, I have a few notes about future content on this channel. I mentioned in the first video that I'd be interviewing tulpa creators about their experiences with mental illness. While this is still something I'd like to do in the future, I think for now it would be much more efficient to just make a Reddit post for people to respond to. I'll add that to the video description as soon as it's posted. Also, to the 2 or 3 people who are still watching at this point, let me know if there's any particular topic pertaining to tulpa creation or related experiences that you'd like to see a video about. Thanks for watching.